Cool, cool, cool. So this is, you guys are largely biosciences, neurosciences, behavioral sciences audience, largely, I think, PhD, so pre and postdoctorate. So yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'm hopefully going to speed through a bunch of this. That QR code might be outdated for this, but if anyone wants a copy of these slides, I'll share. There's going to be an information dump about me and where I come from and how I'm getting into this, because I think a lot of this is just like understanding that biographies in this field are haphazard and they come out of in all sorts of ways. And then I'm also going to give you a dump of information about like resources to get more into this. But I'm seeing here that a lot of y'all are maybe deeply rooted in science research, but have maybe some forays into SciComm, but are mostly SciComm curious. As opposed to like engaging in it deeply. So that is an excellent, excellent place to be in. I love that. I relate to that a lot. And so excellent. Please keep these coming. Okay, so I'm hopefully gonna give you guys some theoretical frameworks, but the real thing that I think I could be the most beneficial thing I can do is I think I can encourage you or affirm or enable your interest a little bit. From what it's worth coming from me and in my voice. And then the other thing that I could hopefully do a little bit is introduce you to folks that can give you opportunities or give you those opportunities myself. And my approach to that is that's the only reason that I'm here, and is something that I would be grateful to you if you reached out to me to follow up about any of these points. Not only would it make me feel like I did a good thing, I want to see more folks doing this field, and that only works if we help each other out. Okay, so who am I? I own this cat that walks around, and this is me right here on the right from my like engagement little photo shoot this past COVID time. I spend about 20 hours per day in this room doing a bunch of different types of work, but I live in Boston, and I'll tell you a little bit about where I grew up and where I'm from. So my folks were Russian Jewish immigrants to the United States. We kind of settled outside of New York, where I had access to like this computer here, which I think was running Windows 95. And I grew up, with an older brother who was interested in languages, parents who were trained as engineers in the Soviet Union. I learned a little bit of Hebrew growing up. Russian was my first language. Learned English pretty quick. You can see me there in the top right. I got to go to these summer camps for kids, quote unquote, talented youth, which is like an American distinction, is like gifted and talented kids get all access to all sorts of different types of enrichment experiences if they have the money to pay for it. My parents scrapped some together, so I got to go to those and learn about cognitive psychology, which is what I wanted to learn. They wanted me to study applied mathematics, but I was really interested in the behavioral sciences. So I did, my math logic and my number theory and got those out of the way, but I was really interested in cognitive psychology and philosophy of mind, all those kind of things that I know y'all, if you're anywhere close to this bioimaging or psycho, if you're looking at like syndromes of behavior and things like that you're very interested in, right? Like what does it mean to diagnose somebody with something? What does it mean that somebody's mind and what relationship someone's mind and brain have, all that sort of stuff. I was also in the bottom left, you see me there with long hair doing a debate. I was really interested in debate and policy. That was me doing Model UN, which our school had a program for. I was very interested in things like trivia, and at the bottom you can see me, we won a quiz bowl show with me and some team members of mine. And then the bottom right, you can see me at 15 talking about why I like to do debate around ethics, because I said it helps me win arguments with my girlfriend, who my fiance now still mention that every now and then, that I was that kind of kid. It's great stuff. Okay, thank you for continuing to write these. These are great. The internet route, that's a really interesting, that's a whole shift, Julianne. We'll talk about that. In the top left, that's me when I got to college. I did a make your own major program at Cornell, where the College of Arts and Sciences allowed us to do something called College Scholars, which is when you can assemble kind of your own major and your own advisors. It's a little bit like doing like a mini PhD in undergrad, just that you get to pick a little field of inquiry and write a little thesis. And I got to assemble some interesting things there. I was interested in, again, policy. So I was on kind of my school's board of student assembly or whatever. I was a representative. You see that in the top middle. In the top right, I lived in a house that was this self-governing living community called Telluride House at Cornell, which proved really formative for me. It was a place where I encountered a lot of disciplines like the ones I'll tell you about. So while Cornell had an incredible program in something called, for example, Cornell has incredible science communication. I didn't know too much about that. Bruce Lowenstein is a professor at Cornell. Stephen Hilgartner is a professor at Cornell. all these folks. I had no idea who these folks were until like my senior year, but I encountered a lot of ideas about science, technology, and society from people like Trevor Pinch, who would just come around to dinner, people who had done a lot of work in the field. In the bottom left, this becomes more interesting now because of my current job, but I was involved in our synthetic biology team, which is a group that decides to modify cells to do something interesting. In our case, we decided to modify E. coli so that they created some sort of molecule with cysteine residues that would absorb heavy metals and clear kind of polluted lake and river water. I had no idea what that science stuff really means. I kind of still don't, but I was really interested in the human practices, kind of how people interpret what synthetic biology is. And now I'll tell you a little bit later, but now I'm part of the company whose founders founded iGEM and are kind of making a big difference in how people see what synthetic biology is. And then I was involved in educational efforts on campus. In the bottom right, I founded this group called Splash, where you could teach kids anything you wanted for an hour. These were middle school and high schoolers from the surrounding areas near a university. I founded our branch in Ithaca, but they have these everywhere. This is a really wonderful way to kind of start doing outreach in your community and getting in touch with your interests, is to teach these free classes. I'm sure there's one at McGill, and if there isn't, you could start it, but feel free to reach out after. And then I did some work on ape language, but we won't get too much into that. So where Estrid met me was in my last kind of full-time role, where I was in a lab. In the top left, it was the Interdisciplinary Affective Science Lab that was co-led by Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett and Professor Karen Quigley. It's at Northeastern. I did some work setting up an NIH study there on Alzheimer's and aging. So I know some of you guys working on Alzheimer's. It was an RR1 on basically PET and fMRI and psychophysiology studies. I did a little bit of writing around psychophysiology and police decision-making. My university afforded me, while I was doing a post-bac research assistantship there, to do some free classes at night. This was a really incredible tuition benefit, where over the course of a year, you get 27 credits. I used my credits on this journalism and law degree that I did at night. And then I did a mini business certificate, actually, right before I left this job last November full-time. And then I also took a part-time research assistantship at the Technology and Public Purpose Project at the Belfer Center for Science and International Relations at Harvard's Kennedy School, which was led by former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter. We looked at basically science communication to investors. So I have a few things to say about that, about why it's so important for scientists who are going to enter industry, and in general for people that are going to raise money for their ventures, which you guys may do, right? If you discover a new substance or a new therapy, you might very well want to scale it through the venture capital space. I think it's super important that we communicate science there in a responsible way. So where Estrid really met me with was this project with a New York Times editor named James Ryerson, who's been editing kind of magazines and pieces by academics for the New York Times Magazine, and then pieces by academics for about the last 20 years. He's been at the Times, and before that he was at other magazines that focus on ideas pieces. And so he and I help run these workshops in addition to my my former PI and some other folks at Northeastern, a guy named Dave DeSteno, who you might interact with if you're ever in the kind of positive psychology or science of religion world. So Jamie and I, we work on these workshops where we teach academics how to write for the public. Mostly we focus on 800 to 1200 word pieces, which I'm happy to talk to you a little bit about that particular type of piece. And then I help run a community of scholars, of which Estrid is a lovely part, where we support academics in continuing to pitch and places that aren't just the New York Times after they finish their workshop. This will be a podcast. We're going to have videos that are going to be up this week as well on that subject, where you can basically listen to people who do a lot of public writing talk about it. And here's some other stuff that I've done. I know this is just a ton about me, but maybe hopefully what this gives you is less kind of braggadocio and more connections that might be interesting to you if there are things you're interested in. So in the top are some podcasts I've helped work on. Eric Lander, who's the head of the OSTP at the White House. He worked on this podcast called Brave New Planet with Pushkin Industries, which is Malcolm Gladwell and Jake Weisberg's podcast company. I helped fact check that. I helped assemble the tape for this piece by New Yorker writer Michael Spector about Fauci. It was kind of like an audio biography of him that was the top listened to nonfiction audiobook on Audible this past summer. I helped with that a little bit. I worked on the Happiness Lab, which you guys might know, by Laurie Santos over at Yale. I did the fact checking for the first 2 narrative seasons of that. I'm a host on the New Books Network, specifically New Books in Neuroscience, but this is a fantastic way to break into podcasting and also the publishing world is to be a host on the New Books Network. It's unpaid, except if you count getting free books paid, which I know as graduate students and postdocs, free books are incredible. So happy to talk about that a little bit. And here's some other projects. So I run the Twitter and I do communications editing for BBS, the Cambridge University Press Journal. That's co-edited by Barb Finley and Paul Bloom. I was the inaugural editorial fellow at the Scholar Strategy Network, which is a wonderful group that you I think can join even if you're not in the United States, I'm pretty sure. But it's a nonprofit group in America that exists to help academics who work on civic related issues get their points out to elected representatives or to the public. And so I helped them with kind of the same stuff that I worked with Estrid in that workshop on, which is just like op-ed editing, basically. I run this educational audio festival called Sound Education in Boston. We've done 2 of them, and we have all sorts of materials online that are all about educational audio, whether you're interested in science. So we had folks from like Radiolab and talk about their work, or podcasts like Undiscovered from NPR. And the bottom left, I do some work with folks that are involved in media and film, doing science communication like in the news. And so the people here is a collaborator of mine named Jenna Barkis-Lichtenstein, who works on basically numeracy and math literacy in public news. And she and I also work on science podcasting questions, which I'll talk about later. And then these folks, Monica Filio-Moher, Elliot Kirshner, and James Williams, are all fantastic. So Monica and Elliot both work at iBiology, which is an incredible group for people that are interested in science communication around biology. Elliot Kirshner is, so Monica does an incredible amount of science communication teaching, and you can find her materials online. She's incredible. Elliot Kirshner is executive producer of films. So he worked with Dan Rather at CBS for, I think, maybe decades would be accurate there. And then he's done films like The Most Unknown, which you would have seen on Netflix, or Human Nature about CRISPR. And then James Williams is the executive producer of digital strategy for PBS. So he works a lot on science news. And so you can find this talk online, but we talk about how science communicators and scientists can get together to research the best techniques of science communication around things like ethics or certainty, these important questions. On the bottom there, you'll see that's me testifying at the Massachusetts State House on biometric surveillance. So I'm very interested, again, as I mentioned, in policy. There's some work there. And then the bottom right is a film that I helped make about my lab's work, which I'll actually show you a little video about. So I worked with an incredible director, producer, basically visual artist collaborator named Van Yang, who's based at a group called Flow Creative Studios. So I'll show you a little video about kind of the vision for the type of work that we've gotten to do together.
A few years ago, I noticed something weird about filmmaking. After directing hundreds of documentaries and ads, I noticed that if the music I chose didn't fit, everything was ruined. It didn't matter who the talent was, how much time we spent on production design and lighting. The music had to be just right. I started to seriously wonder, why is music so powerful? Why are compressed airwaves at certain frequencies able to influence us so intensely? It just didn't seem very fair. And what is music anyway? So I started to take my curiosity seriously. And as I dug deeper and deeper, I discovered a vast intellectual landscape. There were people who knew a lot. We can call them scientists or researchers or academics or investigators. They were people who took their curiosity so seriously, they were dedicating their lives to it. When I had some questions I couldn't find answers to, I convinced 2 neuroscientists to join me and my artist friends to visit the San in Botswana. Geneticists have identified some San to have the most divergent, oldest Y chromosome haplogroups, and I was curious about their musical traditions. They were so kind and generous as we listened and asked, observed and laughed and wondered together. as our trip was ending, Dr. Jessica Grahn said something I will never forget.
I think essentially we're all mini scientists. We are all trying different things in our lives to then see the effect that they have on us or our well-being or our children. And we like to see that, if I do this, then I feel better. If I eat this way, then my life improves. People are driven by their passions in any life career they choose, and scientists are no different. Really, they just want to know how something works. And I'm really curious about how rhythm works.
Scientists are our designated experts to study the world. And that doesn't mean they don't make mistakes, but it is in the nature of expertise that we trust experts to do jobs for which they are trained, and we are not. But why don't we hear more directly from scientists more often? Every year, hundreds of fictional books are turned into fictional films. As we increase our level of scientific detail, we find amazing blue-chip documentaries, YouTube flourishing with all kinds of personalities exploring niche topics, MOOCs paving the way for flipped classrooms of the future. Here in this space is what we want to work on. We want to produce more cinematic lectures, or Cinelects for short, building on the shoulders of Cosmos, Merchants of Doubt, and Tangled Bank Studios. People want to learn, they just don't want to be bored. Let's engage them by transforming static, two-dimensional PowerPoints into dynamic, four-dimensional videos. Cinelects feature investigators explaining their findings in gorgeous films, with beautiful cinematography, dynamic animations, increasing brevity and clarity. In a world inundated with noise, let's amplify those with serious curiosity.
Yeah. Or I'll let you play though. It's a nice little tune. He's good. He's really good at what he does. So I mean, I got to work on those ideas for a little bit and kind of think about science documentaries. There's a lot there. I think one thing that was really wonderful is Van Yang's a creator who's interested in what scholars of the sociology of science, or of science and technology and society, these two fields that study how scientists communicate and how they create truth and facts work. So I can tell you a tiny bit more. So I did a little bit of writing. I got to do some writing about our lab's work as well. I got to pitch some pieces myself. I got to pitch some kind of longer. So this piece was an Elemental, which Medium just actually, I think, maybe shut down. Medium completely changed how they run their verticals because of this past week or two. And then I also have worked with Aeon a little bit. So this piece was maybe about 1,200 words. This piece was about 3,500 words. And it's all about kind of the history of different neuroscientific paradigms. So I'm happy to talk about those. So before we get to some ideas, I can just tell you, so now I still do some of that work with that New York Times editor. We're hopefully going to get renewed to do that work for another 5 years. So if you're interested in our workshops, please do reach out. I highly, highly recommend you apply. You have to have your PhD or have defended by the time you join the workshops, but just contact me and we can learn more about that. Talk to Estrid, she can recommend it highly, hopefully. But now I work at this company called Ginko Bioworks, which is a synthetic biology company currently valued on the private market at about $4.4 billion. They're about 500 employees. And I'm a senior specialist on our creative team. So the company's mission is to make biology easier to engineer. They imagine a world in which there are as many bioengineers now in the future as there are computer engineers. So in the same way that when my parents were studying in the Soviet Union, computer engineering took a machine the size of my room and cost more than a family would make, maybe in a lifetime. We can imagine a world in which there are enough, there are as many bioengineers, there are millions of people who are coding with DNA. And part of my job to do that is to help make biology easier to understand and to make sure that biology is easier to engineer for socially good purposes and with socially good impacts. So I'm happy to talk about that work and kind of how I bring my communication skills to it. This might involve, working with journalists on pieces like the ones on the right about school testing. It might involve, we were on 60 Minutes for our work on vaccine manufacture as well. It might involve working with a camera crew or pitching pieces or doing press releases or working on policy and with lobbyists. So I'm happy to talk about all that stuff. But I guess in the last 4 or 5 minutes, I want to, of my kind of rambling before we get to questions, I want to talk about some ideas. So this is one of my pieces, one of my, slides. Looks like Something's breaking here a tiny bit. Okay, sorry. There we go. You could still see that? Okay, sorry. Yeah, so this is an experiment on a bird and an air pump by Joseph Wright of Denbigh from, I think, like late 1760s. And it's an example of science communication, I think, of experiential science communication. And I think what I try to show this is kind of say that like science communication is there's a lie to there's at least two lies to any story. It's that there's the beginning is the beginning and that the end is the end. And I think one of the ideas about science communication that we entertain is that it's this kind of new phenomenon, that there are people in society who are going to go around and try to, you know, impress other people or explain to people what it is that's going on in the natural world and science. But I think what this shows is, you know, this was painted in 1768. It's painted in this kind of style that painters at the time would use, that's kind of reverential, that shows that the subject of the painting is serious and important and has some romance or magnificence about it. And what you're seeing, right, is this man in the middle, this kind of showman, this demonstrator, most likely creating a vacuum in which he's suffocating this bird. And there's some sort of other biological specimen here in the middle of the table. And you have all these different, you know, people from different, you know, more or less probably the same class of society, but different ages and different interests, kind of paying attention to this or not. They're either dazzled or scared or confused or being explained. You see here a reference to the Lunar Society, this moon, which was this group of scientists and poets and craftsmen and you know, public figures who would, you know, it included, for example, Darwin's grandpa, Erasmus Darwin. And these are people that would, you know, under moonlight, drive around the countryside to meet each other, to perform experiments or uncover fossils or give talks or share with each other, you know, these incredible physical phenomena like the vacuum, right? Which also for them carried lessons or meaning for their social worlds. And I think that we are in lineage with you know, this as one example, right? That's pretty Eurocentric, but as one example of people who for a very, very long time have been interested in showing science to others and in doing it. And I think that that's not just, you know, what this shows is it's not just happening somewhere in a lab or a studio, but it's always in, you know, it's in people's homes and it's in people's lives. And so there's a great deal on the right, you'll see there's a great deal of literature on this subject of the development of different forms of science communication, whether it's demonstration in the Victorian era or, you know, these kind of texts. This is a page from a text by Erasmus Darwin. Again, Darwin's grandpa, who was writing about plant anatomy and reproduction in this beautiful kind of poetic form, but also with these illustrations and these detailed footnotes. And yeah, so if you're interested in the history of this field, there's a lot there that I think it should be interesting to all of us, people that have been studying, whether it's, you know, whether it's plant reproduction or physical phenomena or psychosis, right? These scientific subjects that we're interested in. People have been interested in all of them for a long time, and I think it's fascinating to dig into that as you do science communication. I've got some more stuff about some ideas and then some resources. I have like, the ideas are mostly just like little provocations or tools that are drawn from the academic world that maybe help us justify science communication as interesting or important. Maybe we need that, maybe we don't. Maybe I'll just go over some tools that are more tactically useful for people. So this is a bunch of resources about science writing and science understanding. And I'll Estrid, I'll send to you, and then people, you just look at these slides. So you don't have to, you can take photos of them now or look at them later. But there's a lot of work here that can help folks. One thing I actually didn't mention here, if you're interested in podcasting in particular, I have to add that to this slide. But Sound Reporting is a great book, but so is Out on the Line by Jessica Abel, who also has a wonderful book about creative work. So I think one of the things about doing science communications, you have to kind of come out to yourself as a creative person and not just a scientific person, which means that you want to make things that are beautiful and that express true feelings that you have about the world. And that means that that's hard. You know how like science is hard and you learn that when you're maybe little, if you're lucky, that you learn the experiments don't work the first time. The same thing is with producing creative work.
I
Is
would
there's
try
a
this one.
Oh, hey, I think your mic is on.
Oh.
Sorry. So yeah, creative work is tough, and I recommend that if you're going to enter into the part of like recognizing that part of yourself is creative, is to like give yourself a lot of support in doing so, because it's really hard. It's the same way it's hard to do good science. You have to learn how to, make sure that your controls are right and that your data is good and that you're not, letting some sort of third variable, whatever it is, right? And then all your tools are hard and all your assays are hard and there's so much noise and all that stuff. Creative work is also hard in a similar way, but you have to build up a muscle for letting yourself be bad at it before you're good at it. There are a lot of journals that study science communication in pretty good ways that have good theoretical and empirical articles. There are a lot of disciplines whose literatures you can keep track of if you're interested in science communication and the history of science communication. There are a lot of groups that you can be part of that are full of people at various stages of seniority and who study this from all sorts of different angles: anthropology, communications, political science, psychology, developmental science, social psychology, right? And then there are groups that are full of different types of subparts of the profession, whether they're producers and fact checkers and executives, or they're people that want to perform, in front of other people in live events, or they're podcasters, or they're, they're concerned with science communication by an institution, or they're concerned with science communication, particularly being inclusive, right? Like all science communication must be inclusive science communication, but that's obviously not where we're at now. There are funders for all this sort of work too, that you can reach out to apply for things or to get in touch with, to get looped in. This is just a subset of some of the wonderful funders that I'm aware of just because of my own experience here in the States. You can take a photo. I'm happy to talk about the specific opportunities that each of these offer. If you're totally fine, Rayleigh. If you're a writer, you can also get in touch with communities of writers and with opportunities to write for pitches, to pitch to editors. These are some good resources for that. If you're interested in fact checking, there's resources for that. I think in particular, a great way to start as a science communicator is if you can become a fact checker or an editor on a project. That's a really natural place, because if you've ever edited an academic paper, I'm telling you, editing a popular piece uses a lot of the same muscles, and you'll learn how to adapt yourself if you read these kind of to the media production process. Yeah, and then I have some work I'm happy to talk about in terms of like how we make scientists sound and why scientists sound a particular way in different types of media, and what it might be like if you don't hear I think we've all met a diversity of scientists who all act and sound in ways that are really different from what you might see in media. And I'm curious about that difference, right? And what's captured in different forms of media and what isn't. I'm happy to talk about kind of the history of celebrity scientists in particular, and some researchers that work on that. And then I have, I have some questions here, some provocations about kind of moral choices that you have to make when you're doing your work. I think that science communication is just aesthetic creation. It's creation of something that has ethical substance, right? Which means that you choose to represent people, you choose to represent problems, you choose to represent certain values. And you do that in a way that really makes clear what your limitations are as an observer or participant in an event. And I think it's important to be in conversation with those limitations and to know what they are and to try to compensate for them when you can. So I was into a little bit about me and how I got into it, and then how I started making money doing it and building up into it. So I was interested in podcasting starting probably in around 2004, 2005, 2006. Like I mentioned, Russian Jewish immigrant to the States, we moved around a bunch. And I found a community of people online who were interested in the same things I was, which was Harry Potter at the time. And they were making podcasts. These podcasts were called Mugglecast and Pottercast. They were all about Harry Potter. But whereas a lot of people, I think, got socialized into podcast listening around the time of Serial, which was probably around 2013, 2014, the release of Serial by NPR. That's when millions of people kind of flocked to podcasts. I had kind of had 7 or 8 years where I was really interested in podcasts because my parents were listening to a lot of talk radio, but I was really interested in listening to people who talked about stuff that I cared about, which was like comedy and fantasy books and science fiction books. And so I would listen to those podcasts. And so the podcast boom happened when I was in college, probably my freshman or sophomore year, the narrative podcast boom. By that point, I was interested in podcasts like This American Life and these storytelling podcasts. And then the boom happened. So I listened to a ton of more podcasts in college, and I was interested in some questions, but I had no experience. And then I got to Boston for this job. And my partner and I were out to brunch one day, maybe that first summer, and she picks up a copy of Scout Somerville, which is this like local newspaper, and it said that there was this thing called the Sonic Soiree in Boston, which was a potluck, an audio potluck where people show up with food and some audio that they're working on a story, and then they would listen to it and talk about it. And she was like, aha, and I was like, aha. So that was a local community. These communities exist in most cities. I'm not so familiar with the Canada or what's happening in Quebec or Montreal, but I'm sure there's a local audio community. And the one in Boston was particularly supportive. And so I got on these listservs. There was the Sonic Soiree listserv for this potluck, and then the Association of Independents in Radio, AIR. And both of these, I started noticing, had these calls for what was called a tape sync or a recordist. So when you're listening to a podcast, oftentimes the people that are talking are in the same room, but they're also often not. And the way that you make that sound good, to make it not sound like Zoom or like the phone, is you'll actually have those people connect by phone, but you'll send somebody to the guest's house or to their office with a microphone and set it up and hold it. And this job pays $150 an hour. So what I found out is if I put maybe a few $100 down and I started getting these gigs, I could pay it off by doing a few of them. And so in February or April of 2018, I did my first tape sync. I did it for John Buin of the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke for his podcast series called Seeing White, which is a fantastic series. He took a chance on me. I said, hey, this is my first time. I'd really love to get into it. And he, like a lot of people in audio, are really willing to give people their first shot and take a risk at their project maybe like being harder to make because they brought somebody new in. And he helped me out a ton with that. But since then, I've done about 200 of those recordings. Because Boston is a city where people need to get interviewed all the time. There are lots of universities, there are lots of politicians and artists and athletes who, show up. Like just last week, I was at the FBI field office here in Boston for a story for BBC, and I met Chris Lloyd from Back to the Future and Who Framed Roger Rabbit and all that. I'm at a hotel room at the Four Seasons to record him for a podcast, and so. You get to meet a lot of interesting people. You work with a lot of different producers, and you hear how a lot of shows are made because you hear how they train the guests to talk, how they cut things up. So I would have my original tape and I could listen to it, and then I could listen to what they put up and I could hear how it was edited. So that was my kind of introduction. I also got hooked up. A lot of the story is like it's biography. There's no one path. This is just the path I had because of the city I was in and the people I got to know and who was on Facebook. So somebody from this audio potluck group I found was starting up a podcast conference called Sound Education. They posted a link for it. It was just a page of 16 speakers. And this was in August maybe of 2018, and I called and I was interested in working on this. And then by the time that all was said and done, I was helping to direct that entire conference. We had hundreds of speakers showing up because it turns out there was really a need for a place for people interested in educational audio to get together. And then you meet people through there. So people got to know you. You meet people. Really, like you can apply for, as all of you know, right? Like you can apply for jobs or PhD programs, but what really helps is like meeting the potential PIs you might have or the potential postdoc advisor you might have, right? You meet, you never when you collaborate with someone, it's more often than not because you met at a dinner at a conference and you talked and you had shared interest and you dreamed up an idea and then you followed up. It's very rare that you just reach out and, you could say, I want to collaborate. But it's very rare that you'll be able to get a paid gig just by reaching out and saying, hey, please pay me to do this thing. I'll do it well. Sometimes it happens, but more often than not, you get to know somebody. They know what your capabilities are. And then when they start a new project and they need someone with your capabilities, they'll reach out, especially if you're persistent and you stay in touch and you help them out when you can. So that's really how I've gotten a bunch of these different gigs and hooked up with a bunch of the different things I'm involved in podcasting. It really is just staying in touch with a community and being of support when you can. And more often than not, when you learn a skill, like podcasting is a field that's growing faster than the number of people that are getting into it. it's a really it's becoming increasingly corporate. There's all sorts of like abusive work environments in podcasting, as there are all across all of media. There are incredible issues of representation, all sorts of stuff like that. But there's also opportunity, and there are gatekeepers of all different types. But there's also opportunities for people to break in by being in touch with a community and being relational and building your skills as a communicator. And so I think that's kind of that story about audio. So I had these kind of two or three massive kind of inflection points where I got to do my first recording, and that helped me get more recordings, which gave me a little bit of money to buy equipment and to spend more time thinking about this. I got involved with this conference, which helped me meet a lot of people and get to learn a lot about a lot of new projects. And and then it kind of goes from there, I think, as it does in all of our different professions. And then freelance journalism. I mean, so I did this night school degree in journalism. I was really grateful to not go into debt for journalism school, for J School. I joined all of these different listservs with pitching opportunities, but a lot of it was just the luck of like being in Lisa's lab and getting to meet Jamie, and then getting to meet all of you guys, right? Like Estrid, like all of the alumni of this writing workshop. And then in the process, I was like, well, there's a ton of resources to share with these folks, because I know that there's all these freelance writing resources from my time online, basically. What if we connected them? What if we, and then when you connect them, more things happen. So anytime that like I'll pitch a piece by one of our alums to an editor, that editor gets to know me better and is more likely to reach out to me when they need somebody for a different type of piece. It really being able to introduce people to resources helps you get more in the future on that type of front. But there's a lot of basically places online where you can get access to these communities' information. And as you get the emails from the listservs and you're on Twitter, you'll basically like absorb information, and eventually something will come across the table that you're particularly, helpful at. And with all of you guys, like all of your research is story worthy because it's worthy of funding by the government and by taxpayers and by foundations. Like you wouldn't be doing the work you're doing unless it was important. That's why we chase these things, and whether or not it pays off now or it's going to pay off in 100 years with a total theory of neuro everything, it's still really, really important. And so I think one thing academics do is they in some cases, right, they oversell their ability to comment on something. You've seen that happen a lot in coronavirus. In the open science community yesterday, you've seen all of these fiascos, right? But there's also a lot of cases in which academics, Dunning-Kruger, they undervalue what it is that they can contribute to a topic or a discussion simply by introducing a distinction that's not your own. You didn't invent this. It was someone 100 years ago pointed this out. By bringing it up, you've helped, the discourse be a bit smarter. So that's an opportunity for folks to weigh in. If you want to hear about like how the internet is changing things, read media scholars, read media journalists. But okay, so here are three ideas. So this is from a paper in PNAS by this guy Dietram Scheffelo, who's at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in like the life sciences and science communication department, something like that. Dietram helps organize the science of science communication colloquia at the National Academies of Sciences here in the United States that happen, every few years in Irvine, California, at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And this is from a paper he wrote called Science Communication is Political Communication 7 years ago now. Maybe 8 years ago, because he probably presented this 8 years ago at a conference. So he says, here are models of like what science communication is and like how it's funded. And this is like an idea that you'll hear a ton if you enter like science communication world and science communication workshops. So the first one is there's this knowledge deficit model of science communication. This model is obsolete, is what you'll hear all the time when people talk about it. But the idea is, here's how we're going to do science communication. We're people that know stuff. And there's this audience, and they don't know stuff. In order to get that audience to buy the right products and vote the right way and make good decisions about their lives and be excited about science, we're going to tell them facts. We're just going to get them facts. They've got to know stuff about the universe that they don't know. Here's how cells work. Here's how the gravity works. Here's how, whatever. Here's how like development and political understandings work. Here's how evolution works. And there's all these people that have like no idea what's going on. And like they have this deficit of knowledge, and you're going to fix it by taking that deficit of knowledge, analyzing it, and then just filling it. And this doesn't work and is bad. If you base your understanding of science communication as I'm going to assess the knowledge that my audience has, there are things they don't know, and I'm going to tell them these things, and that's your entire theory of what you're doing. It's not going to work out so well, because it turns out that this is just an impoverished theoretical model. So it's missing so many things that it's not going to get you anywhere good. And in fact, sometimes telling people something makes them not believe in it, as opposed to believe in it, if you just tell them, depending on who you are and how you tell them. So the second model is public engagement. So it's like science is, a conversation between people that know stuff and then people that know maybe a little bit less. And if they just talk back and forth with one another, they're going to they're going to reach an understanding together, And this is also not particularly helpful, because actually this is kind of like what happens, but really what's happening is the thing in model 3 is, I think, the best little diagrammable model of what we can do, which says that there are all these things we know about the universe that scientists manufacture claims about. Some of those claims are pretty good. Those claims then inform mediated realities, which can be forms of media like film, TV, books, textbooks, radio, podcasts, museum exhibitions, but it can also be anything that's mediated, which a conversation with your doctor that's assisted by a pamphlet about a disease, or a conversation with somebody over dinner about the work you're doing. There are all these different situations which we encounter scientific facts and realities. You watch The Social Dilemma, and then the next day you and the folks at the office have a conversation about social media algorithms or something. And that those mediated realities are both influenced by and influence public understandings of perception and reality. So people are always in a dialogue. They're shaping the environments around them, right? People's objections to how their doctors talk about, a disease, or how a school is teaching something, impacts how that situation unfolds. How that situation unfolds impacts what it is people's beliefs are about a virus or gravity or evolution, or if the world is flat or not. And so you always have to take into account, what is the genre you're communicating in? What is its particular rules, its history? What's the socio-political context around who you are and why you're want to tell somebody something and want somebody to know something? And what's the context in which they're inclined or not to listen to you? And what are their responsibilities and needs and wants when they have to act in their own lives based on what you tell them? And when you put all that together, you get a much better kind of model of what's going on. And so the internet is a crazy type of mediated reality, because we have all these new genres of communication, and we're still understanding how they work. And the creators in those genres, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, have these really interesting dances with the algorithms that decide whether or not you see who they are, and with the different communities that sprout up on those places, and the tones that spread up on those places. Is this a place that's ironic? Is this an earnest online communication space? Is it based on memes or long text? Is it based on, where does authority come from in this new space? Does it come from how long you've been on that space, how many followers you have, or for the degree you put in your name or the school you put in your bio? How do people endorse and comment on things and spread things around? All that's, literally dances in the case of TikTok. And all this stuff is still being, explored. The fact that I think one thing to do, some institutions are faster than others to move around. Washington Post has their TikTok, right? Planet Money has a pretty good TikTok, but for each of these, it's kind of a question of, it's always a question of not once something's gotten big enough, right, that you have multiple generations on it, it's never really a question of if the large institutions are going to learn how to communicate there and contextually, it's when. And so, part of the thing you can do is be too early and get laughed out of the room because you're suggesting that, you want to be the first scientist to do really well on TikTok. But then at some point, there's already 40 of them doing pretty well, and it's going to be a little bit harder for you to break through on it. So I think, I don't know. I don't have any unique or interesting things about how the internet changes communication. I just think it's something to analyze in your case, and then decide do you want to jump in and try to be a content producer on this particular medium or platform? If so, like it's going to take a while of consuming and producing for you to get good, right? Like you have to commit to it. It's not like, you have to really learn how to do it, and then you have to get lucky. And then, yeah, I mean, this is why I recommend paying attention to like media consumption reports annually. So there's one called Infinite Dial, which is put out by Triton Digital and Edison here in the States. There's like, Nielsen ratings and stuff for consumption. There's the Neiman Labs at Harvard, which puts out information about media consumption. Pew monitors this. It really depends on who you're trying to reach. Like, if I wanted to reach my parents, I would want to go on Russian talk radio, or try to get in like one of these like text chains that they send around, right? If I want to talk to my little sister, like TikTok's a good place. Telegram groups might be a good place, right? Facebook is not a good place to reach my little sister who's 15, right? Like for my brother, what magazines does he read, right? Or do I pitch to those? So I think it's like, this is a real question of like, thinking about production and consumption, thinking about where you can break through and where you can't, what skills you want to learn. It's all doable. And I think like there are ways of making your institution sponsor a little bit of that, taking a risk on you. The thing I would say is like, don't, what I get from institutions here are behind them getting into internet SciComm, French SciComm, and specifically in this region. I mean, I think like there's a lot of potential, but you need support in any of these. And either that's going to be a lot of free time on your part or money and time. And so just I'd say like, you might see massive potential because you've seen other people get big, but don't underestimate how much energy they're putting into getting good at one of these forms. Because you'll find as you start producing them, all of them are hard to be good at because it's hard to communicate well. You have to spend a lot of emotional energy on it in any particular form. It's worth doing if it's something you're passionate about, but give yourself time. Yeah. So like you can see this, right? So like here. So Open Notebook is this is like if you read everything that's available on the Open Notebook and you read this book, consider that equivalent to a year of consider that equivalent to at least a semester of science writing school, right? Maybe you'll learn more at the Night Science Journalism program at MIT in a year or something, or like Columbia or CUNY Newark or something, or one of these good programs somewhere that I'm not mentioning, and someone who watches this will get offended I didn't mention. But like if you read everything on the Open Notebook and their book, you will, and it's all free, and you read all their pitches, like you'll get somewhere. You know what I mean? Like you invest that time, you'll get returns. And then read the rest of these. Science communication is like the foundation of it is journalism. And so if you pay attention to like journalism in different fields, which there are, Neiman Lab, Story Bench, if you're fluent in that world, you'll get far by taking a lot of things you know about journalism and then adding your knowledge about science communication to it. If you can fuse those two, you'll get pretty far. And there's a ton out there that explains journalism. In addition to all of this, one book, Jack Hart's Storycraft is a good book. I know I didn't put that up here. That's a pretty good book about, I don't know. Yeah, John McPhee is a pretty good writer in terms of talking about the structure of nonfiction. Just read a lot of good science writing, and so like figure out who you like as a science writer. Is it is it Katie Wu at The Atlantic, who's been doing an incredible job covering coronavirus? Is it Ed Yong at The Atlantic? Is it somebody from The Times? Do you love how Wired does science coverage? Do you prefer how the science journals cover it? How Science and Nature, how their news sections cover science policy and science outcomes? It's really like developing a taste for what you think is good and responsible and smart. Undark, like these are some places I like. Undark, and then the Best American Science and Nature Writing anthologies put out every year. The paperbacks are like $10 on Amazon. If you read those and then you start to like learn how to story diagram, basically. If you're interested in writing, it's not in podcasting, it's a little different. If you're interested in writing pieces, take a piece and then break it down into its structure. figure out what a person is trying to do in every paragraph. When they switch perspectives or switch points that they're trying to make, why are they doing that pivot? Can you reverse engineer their outline for the piece? And what did they, and specifically the parts where when you're reading it, you feel yourself reacting emotionally, getting excited, getting interested, feeling suspense. How are they accomplishing those things? Because those are presumably techniques you'll want to, do in your writing. And there's a ton of resources out there for, nonfiction creative writing, people that write memoirs or biographies or histories. And a lot of those tools will be helpful to you too. But you can take any of these kind of palettes of genres and use them in your own science writing. Do you like explainers the most? Do you like comics that explain how science works in a simple, funny way that's very memorable? Then you'll like bloggers, right? And then you'll like XKCD and, Wait But Why. Those are the people that you'll try to emulate, or people like 3 Blue 1 Brown on YouTube. Are you particularly interested in, YouTube physics demonstrations? Are you particularly interested in, book length investigations of people that have been dead for a long time and how they did their science? Then, it really depends on what floats your boat when it comes to reading the stuff. What makes you curious? Why do you get into it? One risk here is a little bit, you'll start to overanalyze things that you used to enjoy. This is a creative thing, I think. Whenever you start to work too much in a particular genre, it becomes harder and harder to appreciate things in the genre because you become more sensitive to cliches and common tricks and tools. But that's also, I think that's probably how, movie writers and editors feel about going to the movies. It's not how I feel about going to the movies. I go to the movies, I watch a movie. I'm not the lighting and the editing and the cut and here and there. And I've had to analyze movies for their cuts before. I've had to for research, my first ever research project in psychology was taking a movie and then being every single jump cut, every single fade. But I can still watch movies. Once you get too deep into trying to really, because it was only cursory, but once you get really deep into trying to analyze a genre, it'll take away a little bit of your ability to enjoy it naively. But that's how you kind of also know that you've done a lot of work understanding the craft of a particular genre, whether it's podcasting or YouTube or whatever. Open Notebook will have things on that. Open Notebook will have ideas about translation, about reading levels. There are different reading level analyzers for different things. You have to remember that, what's the average reading level of an adult in your country versus an adult that's graduated, a particular institution or has a certain type of degree. So it's basically choices about the language you use dictate who feels included in the audience for your piece or not. And this is, there's a whole field that studies this sort of thing. It's called sociolinguistics, right? It's all about how the ways in which we talk and the words that we use mark who we are and who we want to understand us. The way that I'm talking to you is not the way I would explain, not the language I would use to talk to my parents about science, let alone the dialect or the voice or the set of words I'd use. I'm talking to you guys in a certain way because we're all academics and it makes sense to drop the names of different types of disciplines and stuff like that. I think, resources though, the theory is just the language that you choose to use and the way that you make your experts sound will make people feel included or not. And beyond that, I don't know that I have anything non-obvious. Editors should help you with this. You should have it's basically a political choice that you're making, right? It's a choice you're making about who do you think should be able to understand what it is you're reading and who are you writing for a particular piece. In writing my elemental piece versus my Aeon piece, those are written for different audiences. When you read my elemental piece, you'll see that it's written for a certain type of person. It's written in the second person. It's a lot about you, right? It's saying you probably thought this. Here's how your body works. In my Aeon piece, I'm talking about us and we, and I have all sorts of different assumptions about the language that someone will understand when they're reading my piece. And those are choices about where I want to write. I think, here's one idea is every piece you have is actually a family of pieces that's in different genres and in different registers. So you have one research finding. You're going to explain this finding differently to your parents, then to your siblings, then to your classmates, then to your professor, then to your colleagues over beer, your colleagues over coffee. You'll explain it differently when you're begging for funding or, writing a proposal versus when you talk to some fancy person at your institution versus when you present at a conference. You're going to say the same set of findings at different levels. In the same way, that same finding, and you're going to actually, here's the other interesting thing, you're going to say what that finding means or what the implications of it are differently in different contexts. You're going to have different weight about what it is that it says. With your colleagues, you might be bombastic or you might be reserved about what your 2x2 analysis means, right? Or what your most recent kind of staining finding or whatever is. And I think these are all just things to like at first pay attention to. Notice how when you explain what something is, the thing that it is didn't really change, right? Like you did this work and the numbers are what they are, but how you relate to those numbers and turn it into language and meaning changes based on who you're talking to. I think two things that get interesting here are one, so you could think about there being like different levels of science communication. And this Fahey, it says this comes from this guy Fahey. It actually doesn't come from this guy named John Durant. But so there are 3 levels, he says, to like science communication on which you can communicate science or science literacy. He says the first is basic scientific facts. Then it's how science works. So, it's scientific method, different types of studies, peer review, the methods, whatever, evidence types. And then it's how science really works, which is like, how are the debates between scientists impacted by like the relationships between those scientists and their institutions and like so like, McGill, as far as I know, has the strong work on like all different types of like resting state and mind wandering work. How would their approach to looking at fMRI change compared to like people at MIT who are more functionalist, right, and who believe in modules in a different way, or people at Stanford who might have this approach to the question? And how do these different institutes and their histories change how it is they work, and how does the type of grant that they were able to apply for, and how does the individual scientists' like philosophical beliefs impact all the work? And so those are all levels on which you can communicate what it is that you're doing. I guess that's one thing. And then the other point that I would talk about a tiny bit is metaphors. So, right, so like we talked a little bit, so you want to explain to people how something works, but you don't even who here understands how the brain works? Raise your hand, right? Like, like who here can explain to me in a sentence how the brain works? Right? Like, no, like we don't actually know. That's why we do all this stuff, right? Like who can explain to me here how like aging works real quick, or evolution, right? Like definitively, including like all the epigenetic stuff. You can't, right? And so we rely on methods and models and theories, some of which are like pretty built out and they have all sorts of implications, but they also carry with them these metaphors and tacit understandings, right? If you say the brain is like a symphony with a conductor and the different parts of the brain can work together to play melodies or not, and that's how the salience network or task networks work or whatever, or you say that the brain is actually like a company, or you say that the brain is like a factory, all of these are choices about how to explain stuff and metaphors that you use. So I think when you're explaining a method, like, is fMRI like a magnifying glass? Is it like taking a picture? Or is it like, like when you say that something isn't just doing something, right? Like you say, like fMRI works by creating an alternating magnetic field and somewhere in K-space and whatever, like water molecules align and realign or whatever. Like if you're actually explaining like fMRI is like a window into the mind, or it's like putting, a tape recorder outside of a symphony and listening to it at different parts, or, then it's really interesting to figure out like what metaphor you're using and then what it relies on. It relies on your experience of going to the opera. It relies on your experience of working in a factory. It relies on your experience of being in a company. And that's the kind of shared basis of understanding you're using to explain this complicated thing. There's this wonderful, I can actually give me like 2 seconds. I've been reading something called Nervous Fictions, Literary Form and the Enlightenment Origins of Neuroscience, which talks all about like there were plays written around the time of like the people that were first doing cadaver extractions and looking at the brain. Not first, actually, maybe like 1,000 years after the first ones were done or whatever. I don't know. Who can tell when the first time was somebody like decided to anatomically dissect the brain? Whatever. Basically, whenever you're about to engage with something that you can't explain fully, God, society, the meaning of life, the brain, you have to like use metaphor and use these strategies of like figuration, right? And it's really interesting, basically, what in different societies people choose to do with those. And so today we might say, your brain is like a neural network. Your brain is like, an algorithm. Your brain is like a computer. I think, I don't know, like, I'm sure you've all read essays or whatever on that sort of stuff and like the computer metaphors, but I think that there's a lot, when you're deciding to start doing science communication, you'll see how quickly you start flocking towards a metaphor and what it's doing to your writing. Because it's really hard to explain things on their own terms, because like we don't understand them on their own terms, really.